That, to me, is the essence of Hermeticism. The idea of two serpents fighting one another, and there isn't one that's coming out on top. You are just basking in the glow of this conflict. That is the mystery.
Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today we are so excited to welcome back to the podcast intellectual historian, philosopher, and hermetic delver, Mr. Dan Attrell. Now, Dan is a Canadian-born intellectual historian, a classicist, a philosopher, a psychonaut, and a musician, and he's known online as the modern Hermeticist. And Dan has a blog, a YouTube channel, and a Twitter presence under the same name, and he has more than 40 videos called the Encyclopedia Hermetica, A Big History, which is a truly pleasurable deep dive into the interweaving of various historical tributaries into what we think Hermeticism is. I definitely encourage listeners to check that out, and in addition, check out Dan's first appearance on this podcast where we delve into many of these subjects. In this episode, we talk about so many different things, including a new edition of the Picatrix, translated with an introduction by himself and David Pareca, specifically from Latin sources, which is an interesting discussion. We also talk about time, Platonic metaphysics, the Renaissance, language acquisition, and so many more topics. For those interested in Renaissance ceremonial magic, I think Dan's thoughts are not only fascinating from a historical and a spiritual perspective, but it really helps put things in context from many of the source materials that we might consider. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Dan Attrell. Dan Attrell, thank you so much for stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast again.
Thanks for having me, Alex. I'm pretty excited to be here. It's always nice to talk with people who are, interested in the subjects that you're interested in, so I'm looking forward to it.
For listeners out there who have not yet heard your work or maybe checked out the first episode, you are known as the modern Hermeticist. How did you, Dan Attrell, become the modern Hermeticist? What is that all about?
Never really thought of myself necessarily as the modern Hermeticist, more so as just the brand under which I release things. But I suppose my connection to that name, well, it goes back to the sorts of things that I started becoming interested in as I developed through my education in history. So I started with a double major in history and classics at the University of Guelph. And I was chiefly interested in ancient history, so Greco-Roman, pagan texts, that sort of thing. I was also very interested in the Middle Ages and in the sort of, you could call the Arab bridge between the classical world and the world of the Renaissance. So in sort of fleshing out all of these different things, I started becoming interested in all the different forms of mysticism that were practiced throughout the Mediterranean basin. So my original research started with mystery cults. I was very interested chiefly in the mysteries of Attis and Kabyle, but the Dionysiac mysteries and all these different, the Mithraic mysteries, the cult of Isis and Osiris, and this sort of interest in these so-called Oriental mystery cults got me interested in Hermeticism, or maybe more appropriately, Hermetism, in the sense of Alexandrian syncretic philosophy that kind of pooled together an amalgamation of all kinds of different thought systems from different cultures. And instead of forcing them to a close, it sort of allowed them to stand. Each individual system has its own values, its own wisdom to impart, and we can unpack those by exploring those traditions independently, or we can synthesize them into a more universal type of metaphysic. And that's sort of what happened later in, we could say, the 3rd and the 4th century AD with the height of Hermeticism proper. But my interest, specifically recently, has more to do with the reception of these things. So when I was in school, I was studying a lot of Islamic and Arabic history, and obviously I had to wrestle with the literary criticism theories of Edward Said, with his notions of Orientalism and how the West constructs itself through the projection of another, and then endows that other with a whole bunch of terms which are deprivileged versions of what we consider to be Western values. So often the dichotomy is phrased like, in the West we have freedom, whereas in the East they have tyranny and despotism. In the West we have frugality, whereas in the East they have luxury and decadence. In the West we have logic and rationality, whereas in the East we have mysticism and magic. And so it's like, these are the types of categories which, to a large part, Western people constructed their understanding of the East. And so, I thought about that. I chewed on that for a couple of years. And, that theory is not without its holes, because it's a post-colonial theory. So it's more so relevant to a post-colonial world than to unpacking the medieval world or the Renaissance world on its own terms. But in any case, over the years, that led me to read the work of Wouter Hanegraaff, if you are familiar with his work. And he does excellent work on Hermeticism and on Neoplatonism and on just Western esotericism in general, strictly from a scholarly academic perspective. One of the books that he wrote was Esotericism and the Academy, and I found that book particularly insightful. But one of the concepts that he constructed, or maybe reappropriated from another author, we don't need to get into that because it just complicates things, but was the idea of Platonic Orientalism. And so what Platonic Orientalism is a body of discourse. So it's like a set of words that are bound up with an outward circumference. And largely what people call Hermeticism in the Renaissance, or the Hermetic tradition, or things like that, are actually outgrowths of a sense of Platonic Orientalism in the thinkers of the Renaissance. And when we call this stuff Hermeticism, what we're doing is we're privileging the Greco-Egyptian aspect of this occult science, if you will. We are saying that all of this stuff, astrology, magic, theurgy, alchemy, all of this stuff falls under the aegis of Hermeticism. But it isn't true, or it isn't accurate, that people thought of themselves as Hermeticists so much as philosophers. And what they were trying to do was recover the truth. And now these were Christians, so the truth had to coincide with the doctrines of the church at the time. So the orthodox teachings of the schoolmen especially, these were the kinds of things that you wanted to stay in their good books, the church fathers as well. You didn't want to go against them, but the church fathers themselves, they had absorbed and imbibed a great deal of Platonism, a great deal of Apocalypticism, of Jewish Apocalypticism, a great deal of Zoroastrian thought went into the construction of late antique Alexandrian mysticism. So there are all these different vectors, and when we call it Hermeticism, we're basically just saying this one vector predominates over all the other ones, and that's just not the case. The fact is that there were all of these different ideas and systems coming together and syncretizing in Italy in the 1450s, and we have people like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, Ludovico Lazzarelli, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and all of these guys are standing on top of this massive wave, the crest of a wave, if you will, of what Hanegraaff calls Platonic Orientalism. And that is the belief that long ago, there was one revealed ancient tradition of wisdom that was perfect, and it belonged to Adam. And Adam was able to speak with God in the garden, and he knew the language that the angels spoke. This was all before the fall. Adam was essentially immortal. And the idea was that after the fall, this knowledge, this wisdom tradition was degraded. And various groups of people, pagans, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, all sorts of different sects, were revealed an aspect of this ultimate truth. Now, the project in the Renaissance became essentially to reconstitute that primordial truth. And what they believed was that essentially this truth was a Trinitarian doctrine, and that you essentially needed to reconcile all of these different prophetic traditions like Orphism, Zoroastrianism, Judaic Apocalypticism, and so forth. You needed to reconcile all of these things against the truth of the Trinity, because the Trinity was like the great mystery at the heart of the church that they kept very secretly and also spilled a tremendous amount of ink over in terms of defining what it is. And a lot of heretical condemnations were brought about because of people's tinkering, if you will, with the mystery of the Trinity. So what we essentially have then is the idea that the information that Plato received and wrote about was not his own. So that's the core of the idea of Platonic Orientalism, is that the idea of form underlying the world, that there are worlds behind our own world, that as we ascend through levels of the intellect, we approach God or the One, and we become less involved with the sensory realm and we become more involved with the intellectual realm. So things like numbers and letters. The ideas of Plato as they were understood in the Renaissance, and remember, people didn't understand Plato on his own terms. They understood him through the lens of Neoplatonism. This idea became that Plato had inherited a chunk of the wisdom tradition from possibly Jeremiah. That was one theory, that Plato and Jeremiah were contemporaries, and somehow Plato was imparted the prophetic wisdom of Jeremiah. And then there's other people who think that it was the Zoroaster because of the proximity of Greece to Persia and the influence of the Magi. And then others will say it's Egypt, that Plato stole all of his knowledge from the Egyptians. But what you see as a common thread here is that everybody is professing that Plato got his knowledge from the East, because it's mystical, right? There's this idea that what came before Plato was more an attempt at rationalism, was more an attempt at physics, the water of Thales and the fire and flow of Heraclitus, and these people were thought of as more materialistic than idealistic thinkers. And so the idea is that Plato is the one who introduces the doctrine of idealism into Europe, or into the West, if you will. And this is largely, he was influenced through Pythagorean streams, and the Pythagorean streams themselves were influenced by Orphic streams and possibly Egyptian or Persian streams as well. But that doesn't matter. What matters is people's ideas about this wisdom tradition, because that's what causes this huge proliferation of discourse that connects all of these disparate traditions together. Plato basically becomes the linchpin of all of these disparate worldviews. And that's what's received by the church fathers. That's what is imbibed by the church. And that's why, for example, you get various church fathers debating on whether Hermes Trismegistus himself was a prophet who foretold the Trinity, who foretold the coming of Christ, or whether he was an idolater and a pagan. So there are various opinions about that, even as early as the 2nd and 3rd century AD. So what essentially happens is that what we need to do to better understand the Renaissance is not so much talk about Hermeticism, because Hermeticism only makes up a small fraction of what is going on in the Renaissance occult philosophies. There is also Kabbalah. there is also Neoplatonism. There is also the Zoroastrianism or perceived Zoroastrianism in the Chaldean oracles. There is a resurrection of pagan and of Orphic or Greco-Roman mysticism. So there's all these different currents coming together. And when we call that Hermeticism, we kind of efface that diversity of thought. And of course, astral magic is another vector in this, which is Arabic Neoplatonism, if you will. That is the foundational doctrine from which talismanic magic emerges. I suppose we could diverge here for a second and talk about how in a work like Picatrix, for example, there are two constituent traditions. There is an ancient temple worship form of magic that is about conjuring the spirits of the planets, and there's a lot of remnants of paganism in that, late antique paganism. And then there is the talismanic aspect, which is largely fueled by astrological inquiry, and it is more inspired by the Neoplatonism of the Brethren of Purity, who were centered in Baghdad in, if I'm not mistaken, the 8th century.
Dan, just to kind of set this up a little bit as well, yourself and David Poreka in February of 2019 are going to be releasing, or this will be available, your translation of the Picatrix, and it's called A Medieval Treatise on Astro Magic, translated with an introduction by yourself and David. Can you share with the listeners a little bit about the genesis and why is it so important to have a Latin translation specifically, as opposed to, say, going to the Arabic sources?
Right. So the version of the Picatrix that we worked on was the Latin edition put together by David Pingree. And David Pingree himself basically constructed his Latin critical edition from manuscript versions of the Picatrix that were floating around Europe. And so our translation work reflects this reception of Arabic magic, if you will, for lack of a better term, astral magic. We could call it Neoplatonic philosophy if we want to demystify it a little bit, as it was not entirely mystically conceived by the Arabs. This was quasi-mechanistic in its framework. So in any case, the version that came to Europe was then received, and it was received and understood through these various Christian lenses. So again, Christian Neoplatonism, Judeo-Christian Apocalypticism, as opposed to Islamic Apocalypticism that ties into the angelology and things like that. So the reception colored the original intent of the author, Al-Qurtubi, who was writing in the 10th century in Islamic Spain. So where it becomes interesting relative to the Renaissance is that Picatrix is translated into Castilian Spanish first, from Arabic to Castilian Spanish, then from Castilian to Latin, and then the Latin sort of goes underground and resurfaces around the 1450s. And most prominently, the Picatrix resurfaces in Marsilio Ficino, who is the translator of the complete works of Plato into Latin from the Greek. So around 1453, we get the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, and men are just throwing books over the sides of the walls to try to rescue them. And so just boatloads of these books start coming to Italy, and also scholars who are fleeing basically Ottoman rule and trying to rescue knowledge. These come into the West, into Italy, and Ficino is one of the people who is basically hired by Cosimo de' Medici to translate the complete works of Plato, not only of Plato, but of the Neoplatonists as well, Plotinus, Salius, these kinds of guys. Now, at some point during his project of translating Plato, there was another mysterious manuscript that showed up on his doorstep. It was a lot shorter than the complete works of Plato, and so Cosimo de' Medici, rings up Ficino and says, hey, look, those works of Plato are going to take you forever. Can you, before you translate Plato, can you translate the short work of Hermeticism, of the Corpus Hermeticum? And so that's how we have all these different vectors coming together in Ficino. But what we see even in the 1450s, in the Renaissance, is that the kind of magic that's in the Picatrix sits very tenuously with people. So Ficino is okay with the idea of talismans because to him, that's natural magic. Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon had argued for this distinction between natural magic and demonic magic, one which operated through spirits and another which operated through astrological forces, which were natural forces. And so we have all of these vectors converging, and Ficino's use of the Picatrix is not necessarily as it was intended to be used. He appropriates it and he changes things about it. He has a more, let's say, psychological interpretation of the magic system therein. One aspect of this whole discourse of Platonic Orientalism is Ficino's idea of a prisca theologia. It's this idea that there was this perfect form of wisdom that Adam knew and which degraded over time, and that, for example, Hermes had some piece of that revelation. Moses, for example, was another individual who, on Mount Sinai, when he received the revelation of the law, he received it in two parts. One part is the letter of the law, and the other is the interpretative schemes by which the law can be broken up into different layers of understanding. And so this idea of like different modes of doing scriptural exegesis, there's a lot of history in the Jewish tradition, and that's also coming to a head in especially someone like Pico della Mirandola. So Pico rejects Hermeticism, rejects Ficino's spiritualized astrological magic. He's not really interested in that kind of magic. He's interested in a purer Kabbalistic kind of magic that is not really dealing with spirits and summoning entities and making them do your bidding or anything like that, but he's more concerned with becoming one with God and union with God. And one of the ways that that manifests is that Pico writes the Oration on the Dignity of Man. This is essentially an attempt to convince the Jews of Italy. Remember, 1492 is like the time when all the Jews are being expelled from Spain. And so there's like this virulent, rampant anti-Semitism going on in Europe. But it's a hatred of the Jewish religion more so than it is a hatred of individual Jewish people. So the Christians are trying to win over the Jews from what they perceive as carnal religion and give them the spiritual sense of the law. And that is fulfilled in Christ in their mind. And so very rapidly, we see the magic of the Picatrix resurface, but gets kind of quelched or argued with and reconceptualized. So it is more of like a polemical by the time of the 1450s in Europe, in the sense that it demonstrates an older way of thinking about magic, which is this Neoplatonic mystical way of thinking. It is pregnant with imamology and different types of ways of thinking about magic. So we were talking before the show about, for example, the distinction between ruhaniya and spirits. What an Arabic person understands by ruhaniya is not the same necessarily as what a Western person thinks of when they think of spirits. But that is what the reception of the Renaissance mind reads into the text, blows into the text. And so we're kind of dealing with the Picatrix as it was understood in the Latin West. And again, what we see is that very quickly, when it resurfaces, it is shut down by those intellectual philosophers, those people in positions of power. Marsilio Ficino, he's a priest. He is paid by Cosimo de' Medici, who's one of the wealthiest men, if not the wealthiest man in Florence at the time. We have all these different thinkers who are, in the presence of popes and in the presence of queens and emperors. These are people in places of power. That doesn't mean now that the forms of magic that are in the Picatrix weren't being practiced and weren't being carried on. They were just being done so in secret and by people that we would today call conjurers. So, for example, when John Dee gets attacked by people as a conjurer, John Dee gets mad because he thinks what he's practicing is different. It is in the tradition of Reuchlin and of Pico and of Agrippa. He's in this tradition that is above and beyond just dabbling with spirits and conjuring spirits. What he is doing is plumbing the basically underlying substrate of reality. And so he rejects that idea of a conjurer. But what that does is it shows us that there were ideas of conjurers in currency in England in the late 1500s. I mean, of course, right? Because there's so many books that are written around that time, and we get this explosion of goetic magic not long after that. And before that, what we have is a sort of congealing or concretization of what constitutes good, lawful, holy magic and what constitutes dirty, gross, low magic. And this would really feed into the witch craze because people had now this educated conception of how magic operates, and they started projecting that on rural people. People were practicing folk magic, compounding plants and roots, and maybe they also have dabbling with saints and spirits and angels and things like that. Well, once all these learned people come around with the types of rebuttals they have against the magic in works like Picatrix, they start to weaponize those against the common, simple people and claim that they are practicing a kind of magic that they don't even really know anything about. And that becomes witchcraft, right? So there are many vectors that we can think about this, but that's one of the vectors that we can think about the influence of the Picatrix in the West as stimulating intellectual discussion about what is the underlying mechanism of magic, how does magic operate. This factored into all sorts of different disciplines, like from optics to the philosophy of free will. I'm interested in teasing out all of these different ways in which the reception of late antique Neoplatonic texts and then Arabic received texts and also Judeo-Christian apocalypticism all sort of bubble and boil together in this giant cauldron that we call the Renaissance. Because everybody thinks of the Renaissance as like, oh, humanism and pagan learning, but it's like, okay, it's not just pagan, it's also forms of knowledge that are different from the schoolman status quo form of knowledge.
You mentioned too, Dan, that astral magic is effectively Neoplatonic philosophy.
Yes.
Can you kind of elaborate on that? Because I know one of the ideas that we were talking about before the podcast and guests on previous episodes have mentioned is there's two different strains. There's the kind of Arabic / Indian strain of astrological magic in terms of a real focus on the mansions of the moon and proper astrological timing. And then, even though there's a lot of overlap, there's this kind of separate strain of Greek, Egyptian, ceremonial magic, and spirit evocation and invocation. And if you have these two disparate streams, or these two streams that there is overlap, but they seem to be separate, is Neoplatonic philosophy a bridge? Do you see it as a bridge between these two things? Okay, yes. Can you elaborate on that?
And that's where this idea of Platonic Orientalism comes from, right? It is the common denominator between all of these different things. We're not dealing with 3rd century BC paganism. We're dealing with 4th century AD paganism, which has been totally reconceptualized. It has been philosophically mapped out, and largely by the philosophy of the Neoplatonists and the Middle Platonists. I should mention, the word Neoplatonist is a modern term. It doesn't really emerge until the 19th century. It's everybody just thought of themselves as Platonists. Everybody was just working in the tradition of Plato. It's not till later scholars divide things up into Platonic, Middle Platonic, and Neoplatonic. So, for example, a lot of the talismanic magic emerges from commentaries on Plotinus in the Brethren of Purity. So there are all these different interpretations of what it is Plotinus meant, and how really at the core of it is the idea that the world was perfect at one point, either in an Adamic Edenic sense of perfection or going even further back than that and saying in like the perfection of the One, and the One emanated outward into various hypostases, and through talismanic magic we can essentially reconnect these things through the One by bringing together the disparate parts that have been scattered by the multiplicity of the fall of the One. We can restore the One to its place, or at least play on the strings of the universe that underlie it. That's a thoroughly Platonic concept, and all of late antique theurgy was reconceptualized along these lines. We find this in Iamblichus, in Porphyry, in Ammonius, in Plotinus, and then once this makes its way into the Arabic world, it gets another injection of what I can only call Abrahamic or Semitic apocalypticism. And so there's this veneer of what we in the West would consider Oriental, this gloss of or reconceptualization and merging of all these different things. So like Ptolemy, these different astrologers, eventually people like Abu Mashar and things like that, they were all very interested in Neoplatonic philosophy for the same reasons that the Christians were interested in, because it's this kind of mystical idealism which predates but also foreshadows monotheism. Islam would see the foreshadowing of monotheism, whereas Christians would see the foreshadowing of Trinitarianism. But in a Christian's conception of the Trinity, like there is unity in the Trinity. So it's like the center of a triangle, right? The unity of the center of a triangle. So those are conceived of fairly similarly, albeit through different cultural lenses.
Given this huge conversation about time and the definition of Hermeticism and how it changes and the different tributaries and Platonic metaphysics, can you talk about kind of what role does prophecy have? As you kind of mentioned, there was a connection, a seeming connection to some between Plato and Jeremiah. What role does both prophecy have in kind of the Renaissance apprehension of Hermeticism and also apocalyptic vision? Obviously, the Christian sense, we think of the book of Revelation, but what role specifically does the kind of apocalyptic strain of thought have regarding time and this kind of thinking?
Okay, so this is sort of what I'm working on for my dissertation. So there's a lot of things that can be said about it, but I'll try to keep it concise. This link between Plato and Jeremiah is probably not real, right? It's part of this tradition, part of this body of discourse we call Platonic Orientalism. It's this idea that we're trying to link up Plato because he thought in a supra-rational way, he thought in a mystical way. People in later times were trying to project a bridge between Plato's irrational mysticism and the irrational mysticism of the Jews, because that's the one that everybody knows, right? Because it's been inherited through Christianity. So in Plato, you have a talk of the different kinds of divine madness, right? Well, there's love as like one kind of divine madness. Another one is poetry. And what Plato does is essentially writes narratives about visionary experiences. In some cases, things like the Timaeus and things like that, the myth of for example, or the scene of the chariots in the Phaedrus. So there is an attempt to concretize this connection between, in order to give legitimacy to this pagan Plato and his foreshadowings of the doctrine of Christ and Christianity, they want to link up Plato to these prophets and make of Plato a prophet. So we have this kind of like modern conception of what Plato is that is largely colored by the Enlightenment. So Plato is kind of this like white robe wearing academic who works in a building full of columns, and he's got students around his feet, and he's just teaching mathematics or something like that. And that's like one way of thinking about Plato. But the way that the people in the Renaissance thought about Plato and in the Middle Ages was as kind of an Arab sorcerer. You know, he wears a turban. He is an Easterner. He is full of this ancient wisdom and knowledge from different people. And there are attempts to legitimize the reception of Plato into Christianity by linking him up to the Platonic tradition. And now there's another vector to this, which is in late antiquity, at Alexandria, there were tons of Jews there. You know, it's right next door to the Holy Land, and by that time, the Jews weren't allowed to live there. So a lot of them found themselves either in Spain or North Africa, but a huge portion of them in Alexandria. And it's in Alexandria that they were encountering these philosophical circles of Platonists and Zoroastrians and Hermeticists and so on and so forth. So we can't study these currents in isolation from each other because they form like a network of discourse where a change in one node represents a change in every other node. So we have to kind of explore this discursively and take the long route and sort of look at all these different ways in which, like, oh, look, this isn't just Hermeticism. This is also the Apocalypticism of Ezekiel and of Enoch. So you have people like Ludovico Lazzarelli, who wrote a work called the Crater Hermetis. So the idea is like the fountain of Hermes that overflows. And that's the image that the Neoplatonists used of the one overflowing. But his obsession with Hermes was as this messenger between the divine and the mortal world. What he thought of as Hermes was basically an angel of prophecy, right? So he was interested in Kabbalah and in the works of Enoch and these sorts of things. And people usually exclude those when they're talking about Hermeticism. So it is important to keep in mind that Renaissance occult philosophy is as much a product of Neoplatonism, as much a product of Hermeticism, as much a product of Arab astral magic as it is Judeo-Christian apocalypticism. And there is a rich, rich tradition of that going well back into the Middle Ages, native to Europe, which informs all of these apocalyptic currents. Apocalypse is a weird word because in popular conception, when you say it, people think you're talking about the end of the world. And that's part of it, but that isn't what the original meaning is. It just means a revelation or a revealing, literally a visionary ecstasy. And then I do 1 degree remove from that where I say, okay, apocalypticism is narratives about visionary experiences. Because, you know, visionary experiences are common. Lots of people have them. And lots of people have mystical, religious, visionary experiences, and they can't compress them into words or into any meaningful message. And so those visions remain idiosyncratic and lost to history. But there are certain people who have certain gifts of being able to language their visions, and those often become very influential because of the way that people thought about history before the reemergence of the Greco-Roman mode of doing history in this cause and effect manner. There were different kinds of ways you could think about time, and one of them was through analogies with these apocalyptic texts. So these word pictures that are in these apocalyptic texts, people would take those and try to map history out over top of them. And that's actually one of the ways that we've come to having historical periodization. Eventually, those ways of thinking in this ecclesiastical mode of doing history were swept away with coming of the scientific revolution, but it was still a strong part of producing a temporalized mind, thinking about time in manageable chunks instead of just, whatever has been has always been. And the existence we live in now is no different than the existence of our great-grandfathers and of our great-great-grandfathers. So apocalypticism is vital to understanding all of this as well. There are also chronicles and legends and prophecies. So we get things like the prophecies of Merlin. We also get astrology. Astrology belongs within the discourse of Platonic Orientalism, and it was a huge part of mapping out time, both in the Arabic world with things like the Great Conjunction Theory of Abu Mashar, whereby different conjunctions of planets create different historical events on Earth. And then there are also in other ways where we carve up the sky into time, where we carve up movement into time. And this is based along images. These doctrines of images are deeply Platonic, and we can explore those links and the way that all of these different things connect and diverge in a very rich fashion. And that's sort of what I've been dedicated to doing.
To that point, Dan, one of the things that I think we could definitely discuss more and kind of go in depth is Joachim of Fiore and Terence Mckenna. For the listeners who haven't heard the first podcast, we definitely delved into Terence Mckenna, obviously a very influential in the 80s and 90s, a psychedelic thinker, someone who described himself as a psychonaut, a philosopher, he's an author. Who is Joachim of Fiore, and what is the importance of Joachim of Fiore, and how does this relate to more modern thinkers like Terence Mckenna?
Okay, I should back up a little bit, and then I'll get into Joachim of Fiore. And I think the best way to jump into this is to go off of this Platonic Orientalism thing again, and is what was Terence McKenna's shtick, right? Terence McKenna himself fits into this discourse of Platonic Orientalism because his shtick was that there is a world above and beyond our own world, and that through various psychedelic experiences we can get access to that world. And his shtick was uncovering throughout history all these different people who were accessing that other world. And so what he's doing is he's looking at Hermeticism, he's looking at Kabbalah, he's looking at Neoplatonism and all these different traditions that are all bound together. And Apocalypticism, obviously, is a huge part of that. So his Apocalypticism, his vision, I mean, he had a lot of them, but the one that he was really trying to sell for a long time was this idea that there is a universal attractor or a transcendent object at the end of time which was pulling history toward itself, and it cast a formative shadow over the events of history. Now, what is that? That is Platonism. That is the idea that there is a form that is somewhere outside of our physical reality in which our reality participates, and it is drawing on matter, if you will, to take that form, whatever bizarre form that might be. You know, Terence never says, he just says it'll become incomprehensible, or will roll into a plane of existence that we can't even imagine. Well, this is this idea of perfection, of the idea that we are fallen somehow, we've been sullied by a fall into language, and that we can return to this mystical oneness through, basically in his mind, through time. It was going to happen inevitably. What this echoes, and I'm not convinced there's a direct link because I've never heard Terence mention Joachim of Fiore, but this echoes very closely the eschaton immanentizing schemes of Joachim of Fiore. Now, Joachim of Fiore was a monk who lived in the 12th century, And he was kind of a wandering hermit type for a good chunk of his life. But he had all these various mystical experiences. He traveled to the Holy Land, and he visited all these different sites that were in the Bible. So he had a very elaborate geographical consciousness, which was not something that was very common at that time. He was a counselor to popes and to kings like Richard the Lionheart. He was forced to become abbot of his monastery, where he eventually quit because he thought that it wasn't hardcore enough. So he climbed a mountain and formed his own monastery, his own monastic community. And that community was very small and didn't take up too much traction in terms of impacting world history. But the people who Joachim of Fiore influenced the most were the Franciscans. And now Joachim and St. Francis of Assisi lived around the same time, albeit Joachim of Fiore was an old man by the time Francis was a teenager. It's the followers of St. Francis, all the people who wanted to take up apostolic poverty and live a life of basically ascetic wandering and doing missionary work among the poor and lepers and heretics and other groups who would basically martyr them. They took very much influence from Joachim of Fiore's doctrine of what we can call the three status. We call them three ages. Some people call Joachim's scheme the scheme of three ages, but the problem is that Joachim divides history along numerous taxonomies. So there is the 7 days of creation is one taxonomy of time. The 7 seals of the apocalypse is one taxonomy of time, and it marks the various persecutions of the Jews in the Old Testament, echoing the persecutions of the church under the Romans. And then there will be a third echo of that, let's say, time wave. So the idea in Joachim of Fiore is that most basically there are 3 ages of history, and this is God's plan unfurling through time. This is the fact that God is a Trinity means he has to operate through time in a Trinitarian fashion. And what he believes is that there is an age of the Old Testament, of the patriarchs, basically from the creation of the world until the time, I think, of John the Baptist. And that marks an age that is governed by law, that is governed by carnality, that is governed by wrath and strictness. And basically, that's the time that God reveals himself in the form of the Father. The next period of time is the age of the Son, and that is when the Father sends the Son into the world in order to redeem the world and free it from the law. Not free it, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. And then the idea is that however long it took for the first age of the Father to run its course, and in Joachim's mind, this was 42 generations. So he flipped that, and then he said the age of the Son would be 42 generations. And then what would happen is that there would be the rise of the Antichrist, and the church would essentially have to deal with that in history, imminently. It would be something not that Christians get raptured away and then everybody else has to suffer under the Antichrist. That's not how he imagined it. He imagined that the Antichrist would come, would get basically locked away for 1,000-year period, and there would be this period of an earthly Sabbath, basically a Christian utopia where everybody on the planet would be converted to Christianity, and that would usher in this form of Christian universalism that would create this critical mass, and we would roll over into a utopia whereby we were liberated from the law because we would have internalized it, right? So it's not this libertine idea of the new aeon where we abolish the law and we just do what we will, but that we've internalized what it means to be like Christ, and so we don't need it anymore. So the Franciscans they really picked up on that idea because they saw the doctrine of apostolic poverty, of owning absolutely nothing and not ever touching money, of rigorous asceticism. That's what they were interested in practicing. And in Joachim of Fiore, they said, look, we are the people of the third age. We are the people who are going to bring about world Christianity and roll us into this new plane. And the key to this existence will be apostolic poverty, because we will reorder our values. We will reorder everyone's values, and it will be like before the fall, when instead of having our eyes downcast toward the material, we'll all be on the same level back into this like contemplative state where we are all like the angels or the choirs of angels surrounding God. What is relevant to Terence McKenna here is, I mean, not only this idea of history coming to an end or of the eschaton casting back an organizing shadow on all of history, but also this idea of recapitulation. So he had this idea that like there was a pattern that was fractal in the time wave, and that like that was the form of time itself, and he determined this through the I Ching, right? So he determined it through prophetic oracular means. This is one mode of doing history, is by drawing on analogies with oracular or prophetic or apocalyptic systems. So that's one way of seeing a parallel. But he had this idea that the time wave was self-similar across scales. So it's like if you zoomed into a piece of it, you could see the whole in the piece of it. Well, that's not unlike Joachim of Fiore's three ages. If you actually go into his figura, his figures, basically these drawings of his visions, we can see that there's this idea that time is like interlocking rings that are like looping over themselves. It's really psychedelic, right? So this is Joachim of Fiore having visionary experiences of Ezekiel's chariot and so forth, and then remapping those visions as scriptural exegesis. And basically what happened in the 1250s, if I'm not mistaken, was one of these young impressionable Franciscans took the work of Joachim of Fiore and said, this is the Third Testament. This is the work that shows us all of the concordances between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It shows us the like underlying metaphysical framework, the time wave, if you will, that is basically the map of history. And so we need to enshrine Joachim of Fiore as a saint and think of his book as the Third Testament. And this made the authorities in the church just recoil. They were not pleased with this notion that Joachim of Fiore was in any way writing a Third Testament. And Joachim himself was not a heretic. He made sure everything that he wrote was in line with proper church theology, was read by popes, and he was very cautious. But it was all the people who came after him and used his forms of apocalypticism and his visions about basically the end of time and started thinking about how that would impact their present day lives. So if everybody thought that Joachim was a prophet who was telling everybody we need to achieve this Christian universalism, well, who is doing this? There were missionaries to the pagans in the north and stuff like that, but there weren't people aggressively going after converting Jews, aggressively going after converting Cathars, aggressively converting Muslims and Mongols and these different groups of people. So that's basically when missionary activity really starts to ramp up through the mendicant orders. And these are the people who would bring, along with the Dominicans and the Jesuits, Christianity to the world. Arguably, they fulfilled their apocalyptic dream of bringing Christianity to the four corners of the earth, because there's not a country on this planet that doesn't have a church in it, you know, other than maybe the Sentinelese or something like that. Everybody whether they accept or reject Christ, they're all aware of his existence, whether as a force of good or ill. The apocalyptic visions of Joachim of Fiore, his writings, they had a strong impetus in this sense of we need to work on universalizing Christendom. We need to make everybody believe the same thing so that we can immanentize the eschaton. And one of the people who would take up this idea was Pico della Mirandola. In my digging, I haven't found a direct link to Joachim of Fiore because there's quite a period of time in between, but there is a direct link to Roger Bacon. And Roger Bacon was very interested in the apocalypticism of Joachim of Fiore and of just apocalypticism in general, and they largely helped him produce this scheme of how are we going to save Christianity in the face of impending Antichrist. So he came up with the project of fleshing out geography to create maps so that people wouldn't get lost, so they could be more effective missionaries. He was concerned with the development of time, with science, with astrology, with all these different areas of thought, and it was driven largely by these apocalyptic expectations that something really bad was around the corner and that Christians had to prepare for that. And so Pico della Mirandola picks up on this need to universalize Christendom, especially among the really upper-class intellectual Jews of his day and age, because he's hanging out with people like Johann Alemanno and these Mithridates and these different people who, some of whom are actually being convinced and converting to Christianity. And so he's thinking in his mind, look, if we can convince these insanely intelligent Kabbalists who speak 8 languages to see that Kabbalah is really just about the Trinity, and it is really a map for understanding the mysteries of Christianity and not the carnal interpretation that the Jews have, then maybe we can convince the whole world. And so Pico is really hashing out, working as hard as he can on this project of how am I going to convince all of these intellectuals to finally see the truth of Christ, and then I can bring about the eschaton. And you see, like, all throughout the 16th century and even into the 17th century up until Newton, these people are still obsessed with these apocalypses. John Dee is another figure. He's basically the cutoff for my project of how can we restore knowledge? If knowledge has been corrupted by the schoolmen, how can we reconstitute these systems so that we can resurrect a conversation with the angels and basically reforge our link with God and ultimately get instructions on how to make a world Protestant empire, right? So you could argue that the empire that Dee had in his mind, this giant naval force following the defeat of the Spanish Armada, they're like, oh, we can use this to immanentize the eschaton by spreading our form of Christianity to the world. And that's a chapter in the history of colonialism, because right at the dawn of colonialism, when all of these people are spreading about throughout the world and teaching these new doctrines, they're bringing with them all of these byproducts, like apocalypticism, like Platonism, like the search for perfection, like the idea that we are fallen. There's all these different notions which are prevalent in Christianity, but which in other languages or in other worldviews, they just don't have these systems. And we basically, I say we, I suppose because I'm French and English and Scottish and a bunch of other stuff, but the Western people in the 16th and 17th century impregnated the world with these kinds of teleologically organized ways of thinking. One of those ways was the Hegelian dialectic, which then evolves into the Marxist dialectic, which holds that all history is propelled through class struggle, and that if only we can abolish class, and so you get these echoes of this apostolic poverty thing, right? If we can get rid of the dirty thing that is money, that is getting in the way of us seeing each other's divinity, then we can usher in a new age where history essentially comes to an end because there's no more conflict. And the liberal worldview is also a teleologically organized worldview. It posits that there is no objective reality, and so we can only prioritize the individual, and so we'll eventually culminate into this utopia of everybody's perfected individualities. And we know that that view has its own loopholes. And then we also have Nazism, right? So we have the 1,000-year Reich of Hitler, where he thinks that if he can purge out the outsider, in this case the Jews or the gypsies, the homosexuals, the handicaps, and so forth, if we can get rid of all of these people, then we will roll into a new age of perfection, the 1,000-year Reich. And so we can see echoed throughout history all these different teleologically ordered ideological systems that echo Joachim of Fiore's basically visions of the future. And I think Terence McKenna is just one other prophet in this tradition. And I don't say prophet in the sense that he was necessarily right, although we can get into that too, but that he had this idea that outside of time is a form of time, and then that form is drawing us towards some kind of end of history. So the way I think about the whole 2012 thing, if I have to actually defend it or anything like that, and I don't normally, but the way I think about it is that Terence didn't necessarily say that it would be the end of time when the time wave collapsed in 2012, but that we would reach the maximum saturation of interconnectivity. So he was very interested in complexity theory, and in complexity theory, a system becomes more complex depending on the amount of interconnections it has within itself. And so he was saying that at 2012, we will reach the point where we will, as a human race, reach maximum saturation of connectivity where anybody can reach anybody at any time. And that happened, right? Like, we did culminate with everybody's got a cell phone, everybody has social media. I mean, there are people who don't, right? But they still probably, even if you're in some remote village in Africa, there's someone in your town who probably has a phone or a computer that you may or may not access. But the point is, like, we have reached this level, a critical mass of connectivity, and we are in fact rolling into a new way of living that is unrecognizable. So I'm not going to pin that on the time wave or say that he necessarily predicted it correctly by divining the structure that underlies time. That's only one way of looking at time, right? But I will give him the benefit that what he did see in the immediate future around the bend of the proliferation of the internet was, in fact, like a radical new world.
Kind of what you're describing with Terence is just the kind of malleability and the way he saw things and apprehended them. That kind of thinking, one is almost tempted to extrapolate and go, okay, how can this kind of thinking apply to other things? And that's why I appreciate you did that so well when it comes to figures like Joachim of Fiore. I mean, it's just fascinating to see the similarities.
So what they all have in common is this idea that there is an underlying reality behind our own, and that is an assumption, right? Like, I can't count the amount of times I've visited these visionary states, but to suppose that those are not just a further extension of this reality and to posit that they are somehow transcendent and above and beyond our own reality, that is an assumption, and that is an assumption of Platonism. And that is an assumption that enters into Judaic and Christian thinking at a very early stage in the late antique period. And so it gets recapitulated in all these different ways. And I guess what I'm just trying to get at is that, like, Terence McKenna is just another chapter in the discourse of Platonic Orientalism. And it has to do with what are your a priori assumptions. His a priori assumption is that materialism, as devised by Epicurus and Democritus and Leucippus and these kinds of ancient thinkers who were atomists is wrong. So he is sticking his neck out and saying, these people are wrong, this tradition is right, I'm going to work and follow in this tradition. Whereas myself, I feel more cautious. My whole shtick and the shtick of the Encyclopedia Hermetica itself is to show that there are tensions at work behind these two strains in Western history between the materialist and the idealist schools of thought, led by, firstly, by the Platonic charge and then by the Judeo-Christian charge. But the materialist side of things is not as bankrupt as people like to think that it is. So what I like to do is keep both those traditions alive and well and kind of look at them on their own terms instead of trying to argue them necessarily one against the other to find out which one it comes on top. Because that, to me, is the essence of Hermeticism. It is the idea of two serpents fighting one another, and there isn't one that's coming out on top. You are just basking in the glow of this conflict. And that is the mystery itself, right? And so I think someone like Terence Mckenna was interested in seeing the mystery from one side of things. He was very anti-materialism. He spoke very vehemently against reductionism. But I also think that he didn't read, for example, all the works of the postmodernists, or even going far back, he didn't read Duns Scotus or William of Ockham or the nominalist philosophers. And they make very persuasive and powerful cases. And so I like to think of just different models, and we can deal with specific problems by using different models. That's basically how I think about Terence McKenna's Apocalypticism in the scheme of Western philosophy.
With your experience of Platonic physics and your research into how Hermeticism evolved and the Renaissance apprehension of Hermeticism, can you kind of put that in the context of language? Like, what is language in this light, and what does it mean in terms of the development of language and language acquisition and the interpreting of symbols? Can you just kind of share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what we should do is then look at this not from like a modern linguistic point of view, but rather from how the people in the Renaissance would have thought about language. They were very ensconced in the ecclesiastical mode of doing history. And one of the chapters of ecclesiastical history, of course, God creates the earth. Everybody speaks the same language, presumably the language of the angels. And with the eventual Tower of Babel, and everybody begins to mingle together and speak the same languages, God smites them and separates them in order to keep people in their distinct nations. And basically, people had this idea that there was an language which eventually degraded over time, and Hebrew was one aspect of this language that degraded over time. And there were others like Aramaic and Greek and so forth. And language acquisition became very much part and parcel of the idea of Prisca Theologia. It's sort of like, okay, we want to be able to read biblical scripture in its purest form, so we don't want to necessarily look at the text that Jerome wrote, Jerome's Latin. The humanists wanted to go back to the original Greek. And there is this idea, instead of thinking of texts as processes, as we would today, they thought of texts as events. They were written once by the original author, and those were inspired, and therefore we need to reconstruct the exact meaning that was conveyed in that state of inspiration. And so there are all kinds of different projects happening in the 1400s and 1500s, starting with Petrarch, then Lorenzo Valla, then we get people like Ficino and eventually people like Johannes Reuchlin working with Hebrew. There are all these different attempts to find the pristine, perfect, immutable form of a text. So you see how this is, again, this Platonic underlying assumption that a text at one time was perfect and it can be reconstituted into its perfect form. It's almost like texts are like people who get sullied by sin, right? There's this assumption that we have lapsed from a prelapsarian state of purity. So where this starts out with is in the Bible, right? Well, both the Bible and the classical text. So someone like Joachim of Fiore writing in the 1200s, he was not interested in philology. He was not interested in recovering the essence of the text in its purest Greek form. In his mind, he had it. The Vulgate was as inspired as any other text. It's not till we have Lorenzo Valla writing all of these different glosses and his basically humanist researches into Jerome's Latin translation, where he starts finding all these discrepancies. So, for example, one that's often cited is the word in Greek is metanoete, which means change your minds, change how you're doing things, how you're thinking about things. And now when that was translated in Latin, Jerome said, repent. Not change your mind, but repent. And what this did was in the Catholic Church, through the hundreds of years of traditions of the Catholic Church, because remember, Scripture is only one half of the authority of the Church, tradition is the other half. This is how the Catholic Church is distinct from Protestantism. Tradition had stated that you could essentially see in this the seeds of the doctrine of penance, which was one of the sacraments. And that in order to be a true Christian, you want to perform all your 7 sacraments. That's a large part of Catholicism, is jumping through these hoops to demonstrate your faith and showing that you're working in conjunction with God's grace by doing works. And one of those things was to repent, to go to your priest and to tell him your sins, and then he would absolve you, and then you would get less time in purgatory, and that's basically how the system worked. But when Lorenzo Valla went in and checked the text, he saw, oh, look at this. It doesn't say repent. It says change your mind. So you have this entire edifice, this entire tradition of keeping individual Catholics accountable that is rooted in a scriptural tradition that isn't even real. And so this idea catches on that the traditions of the church had gotten too laden, too heavy with accretions over time, and that they wanted to strip it back to the pure form. And that's what prompted research into all these different texts. And now there had been pre-existing research, largely done by Franciscans and Dominicans. And again, this ties into the Apocalypticism. Why did they do all this work to learn Hebrew and Arabic and all of the languages of different people, like even Nahuatl and things like that? Because they were trying to convert people. They were trying to bring about a Christian universality so that everybody could have access to the scriptures in their own languages. So they had to go and learn those languages and undergo these tremendous translation projects. And that's when they sort of reverse engineered the translation projects and started using them on their own Holy Scripture. And that is arguably the roots of humanism in the sense of biblical hermeneutics. And that very much as a chapter in the temporalization of the Western mind, because along with translating the Bible more accurately comes ideas about translating things like Lucian or Livy or Homer or all these different ancient classical authors accurately. And so there we get a renaissance in the classical style of doing history, and that then lives side by side with the ecclesiastical mode of history, and then eventually becomes what we would call the secular mode of doing history, which is largely concerned with cause and effect and moral exempla. So we get things like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon in the 18th century, and that's very much in the mode of the classical historians. But there was this 1,000-year period in between where it wasn't that classical mode of tracing out the rise and fall of empires, inspiring people to look up to their ancestors, that pagan mode of doing things that had largely disappeared under the more dominant mode of ecclesiastical history with its concomitant apocalypticism and teleology. So language becomes part of this picture in the efforts of recovering the past and in the effort to convert the world, basically. And that eventually creates a seat of power, right? So it's Bacon that says knowledge is power. And if you are the people with all of the knowledge of all the languages, that doesn't bode well for the people who you are colonizing or otherwise trying to suppress and cover up their pre-existent cultures and religions with the new religion. So that's one way. There's a lot of other ways we could think and talk about language, I'm sure. I should touch on this. I suppose it'd be foolish for me to move on without touching on this. We see this really embodied in John Dee, and John Dee was influenced by Al-Kindi and incidentally directly influenced by who he called Joachim the Prophesier, who is, of course, Joachim of Fiore. And that's because Joachim of Fiore was interested in practicing something that we today would call lettrism. It was very popular in the Islamic world. It is not the same thing as gematria, though gematria plays a big part in this too. So, I mean, I'm sure most people listening to the show are familiar, but for the few who aren't, the idea behind gematria is that in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, letters have underlying numbers behind them. So you add up those numbers that constitute a word, and then you can see that if they have equivalent values to other words, that is a way of determining a secret mystical meaning that is in the Bible. Since the people in the West had Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, they could jerry-rig these three systems together to create really anything they wanted, right? They could make the text say whatever they wanted by using specific calculations of gematria. But implicit in the idea that gematria is superior to the literal rendering of a text is this idea that there are ever refined states of exegesis that are kind of bent toward the one, and that you get less and less vulgar states of interpretation, things that are like literal interpretation, and then you move up to allegory and anagogical, mystical interpretations. And it's like as you are rising through those rings of intellect away from the sensible world and toward the one, your mind is becoming more and more mathematical. And so you have to shed those literal interpretations. And Joachim of Fiore practiced a kind of lettrism whereby God said, I am the Alpha and the Omega. And so Joachim of Fiore takes this literally and sees in the actual like shape of the letters mystical doctrines. So, for example, the Alpha is kind of like a triangle. It's like a blunt top triangle. So like the top portion, which is blunted, is the Father because it is boundless at the top. And then the bottom two parts are the Son and the Holy Spirit. And then we get the double procession of the Son and the Holy Spirit, which is a strictly Latin Catholic doctrine. It's not an Orthodox Greek doctrine. That sort of stuff, right? That is probably largely influenced by the fact that Joachim of Fiore lived in the heart of the Mediterranean, in Italy and in Sicily. So he would have been around Jews and Arabs who were practicing these sorts of mystical types of interpretation. And there are also hypotheses that Joachim of Fiore himself was Jewish. His name is Jewish. It is a Latinized form of Jehoiakim. In Italian, it's Gioacchino. And so he was like one of the Old Testament kings. A lot of his program had to do with reconciling Jews with Christians, not in like a forceful conversion way, but in a let's convince them through the mystical superiority of our doctrine kind of way. So I didn't want to pass our discussion of language without talking about those two things, because those are critical components of how people understand languages during the Renaissance. There are all sorts of developments and experimentations with both lettrism and gematria. And one of the most, I guess, predominant outgrowths of that interest is John Dee's hieroglyphic monad, because he thought that that symbol was basically an symbol from which all symbols were derived, right? So we get this Platonic ideal symbol that is the form of all the planetary symbols and of all letters. And so he is trying to find a reconstituted, pristine source from which all language and meaning emanated. And all of these disparate projects are all intertwined into one another. It's just very interesting to explore these from an angle that is hermetic, but not using the word Hermeticism too narrowly to only talk about the corpus hermeticum, because that kind of limits us. One last thing before moving on I wanted to mention, because I just remembered, is that Terence Mckenna had a very curious, and I guess he was projecting his own views. He had a very strange view of Renaissance Hermeticism, where he thought that Hermeticism was different, or what he believed was Hermeticism, which let's just call Renaissance occultism for the sake of ease, so we can cover a bunch of our bases. He said that inherent to it was the belief that we are not fallen, that the myth of the fall of Adam and Eve was bullshit, and that we are actually divine, and that we need to take our place again as divine beings in the cosmos and reconstitute the cosmos. That is not true. It is half true. There is not a single soul in the Renaissance, in Christendom, who believed that we were not fallen and that nature was not fallen. In fact, that is almost the sine qua non of the entire endeavor. It is that we don't have the same hookup to the spiritual world, to the divine world, to the realm of the intellect that we had before we had fallen. So I think that Terence Mckenna was, when he was exhorting people to look into Hermeticism, he was thinking look, here's this alternative to Christianity, which says that you're actually doing just fine and everything is honky-dory, and you just need to make art, and we will roll into this archaic revival and everything will just be great. And that's not what they believed. They believed that everybody was deeply corrupt, deeply fallen. We were deeply fractured from our primordial state, and that we can reconstitute that by uncovering the Prisca Theologia, by uncovering the true mystical doctrine that went into building up Christianity. And so he really secularized Hermeticism and made it into something that it was not. And I think that was just his personal axe to grind, because he was always very anti-religious in his thinking, and that kind of skewed the way that he thought of all of these Renaissance thinkers who were deeply pious and devout, but were heterodox, not heretical. So that's a big part of understanding Renaissance occultism, is that it is not supposed to be thought of, at least within the context of the Renaissance, as heretical, but as heterodox. And it's the same thing within the Islamic world. Stuff like Picatrix is not necessarily transgressive. It is unusual, but it is not necessarily frowned upon or thought of as worthy of being burnt on the stake.
What do you think, Dan, are two or three of the big things that people don't understand about Hermeticism? Or rather, asked another way, what are two or three of the big things that you find yourself having to explain all the time about Hermeticism that might be a misunderstanding?
The big argument that is being made in academic circles is that if you look up Hermeticism on Wikipedia, it will probably tell you Hermeticism is astrology, alchemy, and theurgy. But it's each of these things are their own things with their own histories that don't really involve Hermeticism. Hermes might be present as a figure, like Hermes is present as a figure in the Picatrix, but so are a whole bunch of other figures. So is Plato. So is Aristotle. So is the prophets. So are a bunch of contemporary Arab philosophers. There is this idea that when people read Hermeticism, they assume magic. And this is largely in parts to Dame Frances Yates's Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, where she co-equivocates those two things together. I think if people want to refine their language and they want to be more accurate in what they're talking about, Hermeticism is strictly things dealing with the corpus hermeticum. To call astrology Hermeticism is to ignore all of the other figures who go into astrology. We can't call astrology justifiably Hermetic more than we can call it Ptolemaic or Platonic or Aristotelian or anything like that, because all of these are vectors of influence. So I think it's better just to call astrology, astrology, alchemy, alchemy, theurgy, theurgy, and Hermeticism is essentially theology, and it is a theology that is syncretic, Alexandrian theology from the 2nd to the 4th or 5th centuries AD. And we have texts that were received from Ficino in the Renaissance, and then we have more texts that came about in the Nag Hammadi libraries in, I believe, the 50s, and those are Hermeticism. But we need to be more cautious when we're using these terms and not conflate Hermeticism with magic per se. And I know there are arguments to be made. So, for example, there is the theological, which is you could call the theoretical Hermetica, and then there's the practical Hermetica, which is stuff like the PGM type magic. But even then, you're taking one part and using it to explicate the whole instead of trying to find one word which captures the whole. And so I just think we need to be more cautious with our terminology. I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as Hermeticism. I'm just saying it is a narrow thing. And as far as, let's say, Marsilio Ficino was concerned, not a Hermeticist. Pico della Mirandola, definitely not a Hermeticist. Ludovico Lazzarelli now was a Hermeticist. He called himself a Hermeticist. In his Crater Hermeticis, he says, I am a Christian, yes, but I am also not ashamed of calling myself a Hermeticist. And basically what he means by that is somebody who is interested in apocalypticism, in the messages from the divine world to the human world, and what truth he can glint out of that. And I think that that's not a terrible way of thinking about it in antiquity either, because, you know, who is Hermes? Hermes is Thoth. Thoth is a writing god. So again, we're talking about narratives about divine matters. So that's what Hermeticism is. It is mystical theology. There is some overlap with magic, but largely the magic is another thing. And that's why you'll find in my introduction to the Picatrix, we say, like, well, you know, whether or not you want to consider this a work of Hermeticism is debatable. And we would just more comfortably place it within this broader discourse of Platonic Orientalism, because that allows us to control for all the other variables.
Absolutely, and those delineations are incredibly important to make, and I know listeners will certainly, hopefully, think about these deeply and continue the conversation. As we wrap up here, Dan, you know, you have these incredibly in-depth, great videos on Hermeticism on your channel, The Modern Hermeticist. I would encourage listeners to check those out. Aside from this book, this incredible book coming out as well with the Picatrix, with specifically focusing on the Latin translations, what else is kind of on your plate? What would you like the listeners to know in terms of future projects or future endeavors, or is there anything coming up that you can share about?
I suppose in the immediate future, my projects are my dissertation. So basically all of the stuff that we're talking about right now is all directly related to that. I'm exploring the apocalyptic dimension of Renaissance occultism. And so that obviously includes within it Kabbalah, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, these kinds of things. That's a thing that I'm working on now, but that's going to be an ongoing process for the next 3 years. In the immediate future, I'm helping out with 2 courses at the University of Waterloo, one on women's history in the 16th and 17th century. So we're dealing with women in terms of witches, wives, and whores, and spiritual women, so nuns. So all the different kind of categories of existence that women found themselves in at this time and the transformations that occurred in women's lives at that moment. So I've got that. And then I've got another graduate seminar. It's called Picatrix in the Classical Tradition. And we are just going to be walking grad students through understanding all of the ins and outs of basically what I've just been talking about for the last little bit, all the different constituent influences that went into Picatrix, what comes out of late antiquity, what comes out of the Arabic world, what comes out of classical antiquity, and then how was it received in the Renaissance. So that'll be a really in-depth look with students. So probably a lot of insights will arise out of both of these particular projects. I go every year to the medieval conference in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I know you've had other guests who also go to that, like Vajra, and for example, I met him there. So I go to that in May every year, and I've written some stuff for that. I am going to be presenting on Saturn quickly, so I want to give a sense to people what the different planets are like, how do they conceive of the planets. My case study is basically on Saturn, so I'll be working on that. I've been working on another work on poisons, like how poisons were thought to operate, and magical feuding in the Picatrix. So I'm looking at a lot of the more violent type of magic, like debilitating people with mandrake and hyoscyamine, various tropane alkaloids, how you can weaponize those and give people mental illness and stuff. So I'm exploring those avenues. And I suppose that's basically it. I mean, that is a lot. And then on the side, for fun, I'm studying Bach a lot. So I play classical guitar. Right now, I am fairly far into learning BWV 1004 on classical guitar and kind of just spending a lot of time learning Bach, getting interested in these kind of old modes of doing music, because they're all dances, right? So all of our music today is just like 4/4 kind of plodding stuff, and I'm becoming very interested in these complex modes of dancing from that start as early, I guess, as the Elizabethan period, but carry on. And that's like another historical reconstruction project in and of itself, but from a more practical point of view. There's other things going on, but that's the gist of it. And I just wake up and read and write and take care of my scholarly responsibilities. And that's it.
You're not busy at all, Dan. I have no idea.
No, not at all.
Dan Attrell, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast again. And as always, look forward to having you on next time.
Awesome. And I will have plenty more to discuss, as my research continues. So we should plan to get together again in the future.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Glitch Bottle Podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and subscribe and download free episodes anytime on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and on Spreaker.com. Just search Glitch Bottle and enjoy. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Glitch Bottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.